I'm Dave Fitzsimmons, and welcome to today's Star Reader Zoom chat conversation. And our guest is, I'll call him a friend of mine, and an occasional co-host for a trivia game at the Tucson Festival of Books, and the source of all information in history about all of Southern Arizona, from the Paleolithic period to the present and beyond. Mr. Dave Devine, and I do want to read his very impressive resume. You might be, sorry, that's my cat, who's also a fan. Dave Devine is a graduate of the University of Arizona with an MS degree in urban planning. We'll have to remember to ask him about the lawn chair code. He's been involved with historic preservation efforts in the Central City. He himself was historically preserved a few years back. He's written many books and multiple monographs on Tucson and Southern Arizona history. I have this wonderful book, which is a great source of pleasure to enjoy. And in the reader chat, I added a link to his most recent treatise, Historical Tales of Territorial Tucson, 1854 to 1912. You know, if he'd been 3 years older, I hear, Dave, that you could have voted for Lincoln. Before I permit you to speak, oh, this is so much fun, having control over your microphone. I want to advise our wonderful guests that if you have a question, use the raise your hand feature, which hopefully you can find on Zoom. To familiarize yourself with Zoom, look at the bottom. There is a menu bar across the bottom, a field called Participants and Chat. Click on Chat and you can open that feature to ask questions there as well, or gossip and say mean things about the host and our guests to each other. This is being recorded, and I just want to admonish Dave, who's just famous for inappropriate language, to try to rein it in. Oh, shame on you. Shame on me. And now, please welcome my very good friend, Dave Devine. How are you, Dave?
Oh, Dave, you just muted yourself.
Yeah, Dave.
There you go.
There you go. Yeah. Well, hi, Dave.
Hi, how are you?
I'm cheerful and hysterical because I'm ready for something historical.
Okay. Well, so shall I start talking? And I'd like to acknowledge, I see Dick Eaton down there, and he's back in Tucson, I assume. And so tomorrow, August 20th, is Tucson's official founding date. It was designated by the City Council when it adopted Ordinance 3986 in February of 1973. To mark the occasion tomorrow, the Presidio Museum downtown near the corner of Court and Washington Avenues will be holding a free celebration of all things Tucson, Tucson, with music and craft demonstrations beginning at 5:45 and the program starting 30 minutes later. I'll give more details about this diverse outdoor celebration near the end of this chat, but please remember tomorrow is Tucson's officially 246 years old. So hopefully this afternoon we'll have a chat, not a monologue, because anyone who has a question, please ask. And in a question and answer fashion, I'll try to answer some of your questions beforehand. So to begin the questions using a PowerPoint-less presentation, why does Tucson have an official founding date in a place that's been has seen human occupation for thousands of years? Well, back in February of 1971, Al Bradshaw wrote this story for the Arizona Daily Star, in which he said, quote, "City officials are starting to think about having a centennial celebration, probably in this decade, perhaps this year. Everything must be done in proper order, however, so the officials must first decide what date is the city's birthday." It seems that City Clerk William DeLong back in 1971 apparently thought the City Council would like to celebrate the centennial of the council first being elected and taking office in 1871. that 100th anniversary celebration could coincide with the 1971 opening of the community center downtown. So the community center is 50 years old this year. But what date to choose, pardon me, in a place that has seen human habitation by native people for thousands of years proves somewhat problematic, as you might expect. As the Tucson Daily Citizen pointed out then of local officials, they don't know whether Tucson's 100, 105, or 272 years of age. And some people would say, well, they still don't know how old it is. So who came up with the date of August 20th? Well, with US bicentennial planning for July 4th, 1976 already underway, Mayor Jim Corbett, he of the famous ankle biting incident in Washington, D.C., and the city council in early 1971 created a Tucson birthday committee, also referred to as an anniversary committee. Jim Officer, a very famous anthropologist from the University of Arizona, was selected as that committee's chair. And the committee met in late March of 1971 and recommended August 20th, 1775, after discussing other dates, and that was to be the date of Tucson's official founding. Two advantages of that August date was that it could be documented, and it also preceded the nation's bicentennial. And coming before July 4th, 1976 was very important to a lot of local people because they didn't want to be overshadowed by the nation's bicentennial. So why not have a date when it isn't so hot and muggy? Well, the committee did have some other dates to consider. There was November 1st, the date in 1699, when City Clerk DeLong believed Father Kino first used the term Tucson. May 8th, 1864 was when the first local governing body was appointed by the territorial governor in faraway Santa Fe. April 24th, 1871 was when the town of Tucson incorporated. Also given consideration were two dates in May of 1871, when the first mayor and council were elected and then took office. And maybe hot for an anniversary, but it isn't muggy like August. And finally, February 7th, 1877 was when the town of Tucson incorporated as the city of Tucson. But the committee recommended August 20th as, quote, the beginning of continuous European settlement as a result of the establishment of the Royal Spanish Presidio of San Agustin del Tucson. Plus, St. Augustine, patron saint of Tucson, had his feast day, or has his feast day on August 28th, and for decades in early Tucson, there was a week-long celebration that was known simply as the feast. And Jim Officer, committee chair, did acknowledge one issue about picking the August date. Quote, it might be a little ethnocentric, he agreed, or limited to choose only a date representative of European society since the earlier Indian residents contributed so much to our heritage. But August 20th was still chosen. And why was that date known as something in Tucson's history? Well, because somebody wrote it down and they dated it, which is very important in historic research. The Spanish conquerors of this area wanted to locate a more defensible site than Tubac, where they were then stationed. So Hugo O'Connor, an Irish-born lieutenant colonel in the Spanish army, and Fitz, do you know which county of Ireland he's from?
Oh dear. I'm not certain, but I think Roscommon is in, I'm going to have to research it.
Okay. And so he was a commandant in the Spanish army, and he was the commandant and inspector of all the frontier posts on this new Spain. In 1875, he chose a new site for a presidio, or fort, on a low bluff overlooking the east side of the Santa Cruz River. He fortunately put that decision as well as the date in writing in a certificate like this. And as I said, it's always helpful to date things because when people hundreds of years later go looking to see when it happened, they can say, oh, that's dated. Because if it isn't, then they have to guess. So O'Connor certified on August 20th, 1775, he chose and marked out with two others, quote, for the new situation of said Presidio with the denomination of St. Augustine de Tucson, because the requisite conditions of water, pasture, and wood occur as well as the perfect closing of the Apache frontier. So, was the August 20th date universally accepted? Well, this being Tucson, the answer to that is obvious, right? No. When he learned of the choice of the August 20th date, Henry Dobbins, professor of anthropology, wrote new Mayor Lou Murphy, as well as Jim Officer in early 1972. He objected to that date being selected, noting, quote, all that O'Connor did on 20 August was to inspect the site where the post that located a two-back was later to move. O'Connor did not establish a garrison at Tucson on that date. He only inspected the area and chose a site for a future garrison, end quote. Instead of August 20th, Dobbins wanted more research to be done to determine when the Presidio was actually occupied in Tucson. Now, as fate turned out, Jim Officer got his letter 4 hours after he had gone to the city council to recommend the August 20th date. And while he agreed that August 20th was not the date that Presidio in Tucson was occupied, he did stand by his recommendation to keep Tucson's official founding date as August 20th. So after that was accomplished, what else did the 1971 Tucson Birthday Anniversary Committee do? Well, they started planning for a bicentennial event in 1975, as well as pledging to prepare a booklet of important dates in Tucson's history. And a few of the committee members also worked with several others to help establish the Tucson Historical Committee, which would eventually become today's Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission. So what happened after the August 20th date was approved by the City Council? Well, before the end of 1971, the Birthday Anniversary Committee had compiled a chronology of important events in Tucson, which I have a copy of here, starting in the year 800. We now know that date of settlement of this area should be much earlier by thousands of years. Around August 20th, 1971, the recommendation was also made by a committee of the Arizona Historical Society to rename many downtown streets to their original names. Some streets like Church and Ochoa would retain their names, but others like Broadway would be returned to Camp Street, and Pennington would once again be called Calle del Arroyo. Those were the recommendations made 50 years ago, and here we are, and Pennington is still Pennington, and Broadway is still Broadway, so we're still waiting on that one. In 1972, the Tucson Historical Committee appointed a Bicentennial Planning Steering Committee, and in February of 1973, the Tucson City Council officially adopted this document, Ordinance 3986, establishing August 20th, 1775 as the founding date of the city of Tucson. The same ordinance authorizes a bicentennial anniversary celebration. To get a head start on Tucson's bicentennial, despite raindrops, in 1973, Tucson started celebrating August 20th. And here's a picture of Mayor Lou Murphy reading a proclamation. And several hundred of people attended an event in 4 square blocks around City Hall. And food was sold, free rides were given in a stagecoach, but most of the anticipated political speeches were interrupted by the rain showers. That's not, thankfully, predicted to happen this year. Now, the next year, 1974, Tucson's 199th anniversary, according to the city, Jim Officer wrote, Tucson celebrates the 199th birthday of Tucson at the Civic Center, Fremont House, Presidio Park, Fort Lowell, and throughout the city. And so the tradition of celebrating August 20th had begun. So what took place on the bicentennial date, August 20th, 1775? A lot. And it was very well publicized. In this story written by in the Star by Judy Donovan, she wrote of the day, today is the 200th birthday of Tucson, and then for the next 5 days and nights, the old Pueblo will pay tribute to the anniversary with an unprecedented array of festivities. Each day had a different theme. Wednesday, August 20th was official birthday, opened by an ecumenical service followed by a breakfast at which, quote, desert Indian performers performed, end quote. In the evening, there was a band concert, then a procession from downtown's El Tiradillo to the Wishing Shrine. The next day was Youth Day that included athletic events and a performance by the locally organized musical group Up With People. Women's Day had educational exhibits, a fashion show, and a meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women. The day devoted to a time to celebrate focused on Mexican and Chinese communities and concluded with a gala ball and midnight buffet. Finally, All Faith Sunday concluded the festivities with fireworks as part of the libretto of the Spanish opera La Revoltosa. So that was the bicentennial celebration in Tucson. It was 5 days worth of activities. So what happened after that? Oh, and I should show you, here's the program, the bicentennial program cover. And as I said, it got a lot of coverage. Here's a page in the Star, which I think is very well done. It has the names of many people in Tucson's history on it. And then the Citizen also had a front page story about, in the entire front page, about Tucson's 200th anniversary. So after that ceremony, what happened then? Well, some years had major celebrations, others simply a flag raising ceremony downtown and cake being eaten, with both types of events being sponsored by the Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission. So in the small category was 1980, the city's 205th anniversary. And as you can see, about 60 people attended the flag raising ceremony downtown, and that included a reading of letters and telegrams. Whatever a telegram is, I don't know. And those telegrams came from national and local politicians. And this was followed by eating pieces from a giant cake. 1981 also had a small celebration, as shown in this article by Joe Burchell. But the reason I copied this was to show you the photograph there, the dump on the west side of the Santa Cruz River. And that dump is approximately where Mission Gardens is today. And so we have made progress. It's been 40 years, but we have made progress in this town, because Mission Gardens is one of our success stories, in my opinion, as to what a group of volunteers can do when they put their minds to it. And it's a great place to go, in my opinion, as is the Presidio Museum.
Dave,
So, yes.
Dave, I want to interrupt. Sorry about the echo. I just want to emphasize to folks here, if you have not been to the Presidio Museum downtown, you gotta go. And tomorrow, wouldn't you agree, Dave? Tomorrow would be the perfect opportunity. I mean, the Presidio will be at its loveliest tomorrow.
I absolutely agree with that. I would suggest people get there probably fairly early and realize that parking can be a challenge. But when the Presidio was here first open, of course, parking was not a challenge. But then again, there are other challenges that people faced back then. But no, it is a great place that summarizes Tucson's very long history, because human habitation has been here for thousands of years. And I think that that's something that this community can be proud of acknowledging.
Rich, I got to say, brings me to a question I see in the reader chat. I just love interrupting you. Sorry, Dave.
That's fine.
I don't mean to derail you, but Allison Hughes has a good question. She asked if any Tana Autumn people were on the committee that was chaired by Jim Officer. Do you know?
I do not believe so. I have a list of the names, and most of those people I do not know, but none of the names that I was familiar with from the Tohono Nation that I saw on that list. No.
All right.
Which, frankly, Jim was renowned for inclusiveness, and but the committee moved quite quickly, and who knows why the people who ended up on it were chosen. That I do not know.
Kathy Scott, you have a question. Would you care to unmute yourself and ask Mr. Devine?
Yes, hello. Okay, my question is, was Spanish ever considered an official language in what is now Tucson?
Oh, absolutely. Spanish was the primary language spoken here till the early years of the 20th century. My good friend Connie Weinstapel, who was a longtime Southern Pacific engineer, grew up downtown in Armory Park, and he spoke Spanish in his youth more than he spoke English. And in his last year, Connie reverted to speaking Spanish. And so the language of commerce, as well as the language on the street, was Spanish here for a long time. It was only in the early years of the 20th century when the Anglo majority or the Anglo population became a majority that English started being spoken widely.
I took a look at chapter titles in your most recent book,
Yes.
and they're really provocative. So I just got to ask you about the chapter titles. You tease you. For example, my favorite, chapter 10, it's entitled A Toe Tickler and Other Tucsonans.
Yes.
What the heck, Dave?
Well, to give you a little background, so the late Jim Ayers was a archaeologist who was in charge of the research for the urban renewal area in Tucson back in the late 60s and throughout the decade of the 1970s. And as those of you who know the history of that area know, that there was a small but significant Chinese presence in downtown Tucson beginning in around 1875. And Jim became fascinated because of his work down in the urban renewal area with the Chinese in Tucson. And so in the year 2000, he started researching mentions of the Chinese in both the Star and the Citizen in territorial area newspapers. And that research then evolved into something much larger. It became an index of both the Star and the Citizen from 1875 to 1912. And it has about 300 categories and about 200,000 different listings of newspaper stories. And one of those is called Miscellaneous. And in one of those stories, it was Toe Tickler. So being the kind of guy I am, I had to look that up, right? And so early in the 20th century, a man was downtown and drank too much tequila and was going home. And there were a few Syrian families living basically in a row house where the convention center is today. And this enumerated man knew that. And so he walked in their front door, because nobody locked their door back then in Tucson. And he collapsed in a chair. And of course, a woman in the household let out a scream. And a patrol officer came running and arrested the man. And he was taken to court the next morning. And the judge asked him, "Why did you walk into their house?" He said, "I just wanted to tickle their toes." And so I thought that was a perfect analogy for many things, Tucson. He was then sentenced to 10 days in prison, I believe. And he probably regretted his decision after working on a road gang for 10 days. But that's where that story comes from.
That's a very good call. Well, you mentioned the arrival of Chinese immigrants. Yeah. And I assume that the Tucsonans, being lovely human beings, welcomed these new immigrants with open arms. Is that the case, Dave?
Well, not quite. Now, as has been pointed out by some researchers, the violence against the Chinese in Tucson was not too great. Kids threw snowballs at them when it snowed, and sometimes they pulled the men's hair. And the business community did try in the 1880s to form a group to boycott Chinese businesses. And certainly both newspapers, particularly the Star, L.C. Hughes, the editor of the Star, was clearly a racist, and he hated the Chinese. And he did his newspaper did everything they can to stir up public opinion against them. But the Chinese community, there were about 300 Chinese living here by 1900, and most of them lived basically where the Tucson Water Building is today, in a small Chinatown. And they persevered. Economically, they were quite successful. And then by the early years of the 20th century, though political leaders thought Chinatown in Tucson was a unsightly area, and so they decided to do one of the first urban renewal projects in Tucson. Long before the convention center was built, Chinatown was demolished to widen Alameda Street and to put in a small park. And so the Chinese at that point who lived in Chinatown migrated south of Congress Street to a large structure. And it was that structure's remains that Jim Officer unearthed as part of his work for the urban renewal project in the 1960s and 70s. So the Chinese presence in Tucson has always been quite significant. Their numbers have never been very large, but they have contributed a lot to this community's history.
Sandy R. has a relevant comment, wants to know your opinions on urban renewal itself, and our conversations in this valley about the construction of a freeway.
So as I just mentioned, the removal of Chinatown in Tucson wasn't the first urban renewal project, but it was one of the earliest ones. And that's been a common thread throughout Tucson's history since the 19th century. And clearly the urban renewal project that resulted in the convention center was controversial back then for the way both it was handled and the whole idea as to why that would be done. On the other hand, there were some people who lived in the barrio who did want to move, and they were allowed to do that with the payments they got from the city, although the city was very tight-fisted with the money they handed out. And I came here shortly after the convention center opened, and the question I've always wondered was, there was plenty of vacant land available to build that complex, and why that wasn't done, I haven't heard an answer to. Because it clearly, in the long term, was an unfortunate decision, because if the entire barrio had remained standing, we would have had an asset that would have been unparalleled in this country. But it was decided not to do that. And so the convention center was built, but we continue to, in my opinion, look at our historic resources with less than the favor that we should, that we tend to look to remove the old and replace with the new because we think the new is more attractive. And that, I think, is not a wise decision. And fortunately, I think that attitude has been changing in this 21st century, but still we've lost so much that we have to be very protective of everything we have left.
Kathy, Donahue has a question. Feel free to unmute and fire away.
Okay. I know, well, at least I think I know that the impetus for Chinese coming to the West often was working on the railroad. Right? What was behind their coming to Tucson?
Well, from my research, and others have done a lot more about this than I have. The first few Chinese men who came here in around 1875 came simply for the economic opportunities. Much like the European men who came here, this was a place where money could possibly be made. And then when the railroad stopped construction in May of 1879 up in Casa Grande, most of that crew laying the track were Chinese. And so everybody on that crew was fired because they ran out of ties, and plus it was getting too hot to work. So everybody was sent on their separate ways. And some of those Chinese men then came to Tucson to open businesses. and didn't go back to work for the railroad because they could make more money in Tucson than they could working on the railroad because Southern Pacific paid them $1 a day. But when railroad construction then resumed in February of 1880, a lot of Chinese men were still on that crew, and the census in 1880 shows hundreds of Chinese men in Pima County, but these were all enumerated out near Vail because that's where the tracks were by that point in time. And so the Chinese presence started before the railroad, but the railroad coming in 1880 certainly brought more Chinese men to Tucson.
Mhm.
Are you have acquaintances with the Mission Convento effort? I'm curious about your opinions about recreating structures, which I personally favor, because I like to point out to my relatives and kids who visit that there were people here before whites arrived in the valley. But I know some purists don't like the idea of recreations. What's your opinion?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances. I thought the Rio Nuevo proposal for the west side of the Santa Cruz was a good one because that would have been the centerpiece of a multiplex of buildings devoted to Tucson's history. And of course, that project was mishandled, and so we're not going to see that. But I thought as part of that entire complex, the recreation of the convento would have been an outstanding way to demonstrate or to show people that influence prior to the arrival of most of the Europeans.
Can you describe for our folks here what was at that site when it was thriving?
Well, now, you know, when you get before the gas and purchase, Dave gets a little sketchy with his facts here. So
I know you were there, Dave. I know this will be a first person account.
So Santaveer was established by Father Kino, around 1700 with a small church. And then the present church was started late in the 18th century and finished several years later. And then in around, and I could be wrong about this, in around 1845 or 50, what was called a visita, or another church, was established at the base of a mountain. And that was just like a annex, if you would, 7 miles north of the mission, Santaveer, where there were a priest periodically, sometimes permanently, as well as other religious people and some native people. And to produce fruits and vegetables, what did those people at that convento site do? Well, they planted a garden, right? And it was a fairly large garden because they had water in the Santa Cruz most of the time. And there have been canals in Tucson for thousands of years. And so there was a canal system over there that they could tap into. And so they started planting things. And eventually that convento site was abandoned. And the building stayed there for decades. And it was made out of adobe brick. And so it started deteriorating because of the weather. And eventually, and people were stealing the bricks as they did of the Presidio wall. People just took the adobe, and the convento site melted back into the earth. But the city gave it some incentive because that's where that dump is, as I mentioned, and some of it was, I believe, plowed into that dump. So at least the Mission Gardens has been restored. And they have events all the time to which the public is invited. It's a wonderful place to go. And it's our one remaining symbol of that development at the foot of a mountain or the foot of the Black Hill, as the native language says, which I have heard is the result of the word Tucson.
Huh. Question comes from my colleague, Sarah Brown. where does your passion for Tucson history come from?
Well,
What's wrong with you, Dave?
as some of you may know, back in the 1980s, I was the director of the West University Neighborhood Association when it had money to actually pay a staff person.
Yeah.
And the West University is a very historic neighborhood, developed west of the campus at about the time the campus was established back in 1891. Anyways, and so I became interested in European history in Tucson back then. And then when I went to work for Molly McCaslin on the city council, the Tucson Arts District Partnership wanted to try and encourage the development of the warehouses along the railroad tracks on Toole Avenue. And I, along with Sarah Clemens and some other people at the partnership, were given the objective of placing the warehouse district on the National Register of Historic Places. And so I researched the history of every one of those buildings. And so that was kind of an interesting history because we had a mix of populations down there, because where 4th Avenue businesses are today used to be a residential neighborhood until it was all urban renewal, because businesses create more revenue than homes do. And but so back in 1995, I wrote my first monograph about the history of the warehouse district. And here it is 26 years later, and I'm still churning out the words. Because the subjects never stop, right? There are always toe ticklers that come up, and that it just is very interesting to find out about this stuff.
One of my favorite historical sites is El Tiradito, which I love to take visitors to and then share the story I've heard related to that shrine. And I'm wondering, is the story I'm sharing a myth? Do you know?
I don't know.
You know,
It's a good story. Like much of history, it's a good story. And whether it's true or not, I don't know. But it's a good story. And certainly a lot of people believe it's true. And I will tell you that even back in the 19th century newspapers, it was alleged to be true, but I don't know of any historic documentation of its truthfulness.
Oh, it's got everything. It's
Yes, it
wonderfully, it's violent, it's got lust, jealousy, axe murder, right? The mother, the daughter, pregnant daughter, throwing herself down the well in despair. And then doesn't the murderer return a year later to recover his cattle? And I heard that he was stopped by Apaches and more or less crucified on a saguaro. Good stuff.
Well, as I said, it's a good story. And as those of us who research and write about history know, sometimes good stories overcome historic accuracy because they're just so good that we can't ignore them.
Yeah. What is your, I'm curious about your opinion in terms of the racial questions posed by the Ariva Canyon Massacre, which I wrote about recently. That was what,
1871.
Thank you. People will argue the context of the times that I'm not even going to go there. Hey, Dave, you take that hot potato because I was going to say on our current moral understanding, we might argue that the people in Tucson whom we heroicize, Sam Hughes, folks like that, under a magnifying lens, we might not be so inclined to heroicize them. But
well, and of course, there was an effort by one of the Cummingses many years ago to rename Sam Hughes Elementary School because he knew the history of Ariva Canyon and Sam Hughes's involvement with that massacre. I think personally, my opinion is we need to know this history, we need to acknowledge it, and we need to be aware that sometimes the people that we are honoring may not be all that honorable by from today's viewpoint. But we need to know also setting or the context of what was going on both sides. I mean, clearly the Apaches were killing a lot of Mexicans and Anglos. And clearly the Anglos and the Mexicans and the native people here were killing a lot of Apaches. That was a particular massacre, though, that was unwanted, it was unnecessary, and it was unhelpful. And it resulted in some things, though. I mean, U.S. Grant, who was the president, was aware of that massacre and took steps to make sure it wouldn't happen again. And so that's the kind of history I think we need to be aware of on both sides, because if we're not, if we're only one-sided in our viewpoints of things, we're in real trouble.
I noticed you write in the foreword to your recent book, a knowledge of history can hopefully be used as a predictor of future occurrences.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that would be somewhat impacted by, the environmental changes we might be facing ahead, which are difficult to predict. But do you have a sense of the lifespan of this valley, the future?
Well,
You got 5 minutes, Dave.
well, maybe I'll answer that quickly and then I'll recap what's happening tomorrow at the Presidio Museum. I've done enough traveling. My wife and I have traveled all around the world. And if you visit a lot of places, particularly desert communities, they come and they go. And we should be aware of that civilizations have existed on this planet for many years, for hundreds or even sometimes thousands of years, and they disappear for various reasons. They move on or they just die out. And we should be aware of that. And when you build an infrastructure and a society based on short-term goals, like water projects in the desert, sometimes you may pay a price in the long run. So you, Fitz, and I will not be here to know that history, but some younger people might be, and I hope they are aware of how we got here at that point. And with that, let me summarize what's going on tomorrow at the Presidio Museum.
I just got to thank you for that upbeat analysis. Thank you.
Well, what can I say? If you've ever traveled to Egypt, you know what happens.
That's
right.
true.
Okay, so at the Presidio Museum downtown, there will be a celebration of all things Tucson, to celebrate our multicultural heritage. It is presented by the museum and the Tucson-Pima County Historical Commission. The gates open at 5:45 p.m. with craft demonstrations and music. Then the program begins at 6:15 p.m. with mariachi, folklorical, and Waila music, blessing by young ladies of the Tohono Nation, a lion dance from the Chinese Cultural Center, and a posthumous award to Richard Elias, member of the Pima County Board of Supervisors, who was an ardent supporter of people knowing Tucson's history. Food and drink will be available for purchase. In addition, there will be numerous crafts and demonstrations provided by groups, including the Arizona Historical Society, Southern Arizona Transportation Museum, Buffalo Soldiers, and Presidio Garrison reenactors. The museum is located at 196 North Court Avenue, west of Church Avenue. And I would like to conclude by thanking you all for attending. And I have a trivia question.
Yes.
Okay. So on August 20th, 1925, the Star ran a story about a recent Time magazine article that profiled what longtime best-selling author, with Time writing of him, quote, he inhabits a quiet Spanish mission bungalow near Tucson. And the winner gets absolutely nothing but the notoriety of answering this question.
Wow.
Here's a hint. His name is on the cornerstone of the Temple of Music and Art. Here's another hint. He came to Tucson because he had suffered from tuberculosis. Here's a final hint. If somebody doesn't get this one, Ken Scoville, I know, knows this, but he has a subdivision named after him at the corner of Wilmot and Speedway because that's where his house was and still is.
Now, if you make your correct guess, you might be right, and I might ring a bell.
Yes. His first name is Harold. His second name was Bell.
Yes, Sandy R. got it.
Okay.
Good guess, Sandy R. Yay. Good question.
Did
I,
Kathy have a question for Dave?
Kathy Donahue?
Yeah, I think she's got her hand raised, or maybe that was on accident.
That wasn't, I just wondered that maybe this is, maybe we should just end on the note, but that you just ended on. But I was just wondering, as you were talking about Sam Hughes and some of the people who, they need some context to understand why they're revered or not. And do you find this current atmosphere with, we'll say, with people being so hypersensitive, hyperactive about critical race theory, that it impacts how you will teach children about their history, good and bad? Because you know, I mean, it does seem like Ducey would like to protect them from anything that's unpleasant.
Well, I'm certainly not familiar with the educational system in Arizona now or ever.
No.
Um,
Well, me neither.
all I can say is when I, many centuries ago, was in grade school and high school, we were given a European-centric education about history. And I think that was unfortunate then, and I think it's unfortunate now. One of the biggest influences I had on my life was taking a course in Russian history in high school, which taught me about a different culture and a different society, a different way of looking at history. And I think that it's important that school children understand that there are many ways of looking at things, but it's important to point out both the good and the bad, because that's who we are as humans. None of us is perfect, and none of us is totally evil, or very few of us are totally evil, and that we have to know both sides of the coin and then make our own decisions as to how important things were and how honorable people were and how influential they were, and whether we should respect them or not. And so my understanding of the state law that the governor signed isn't going to prevent educators in the state of Arizona from teaching both the good and the bad.
Good.
And hopefully that's what will happen.
Hope so.
I think it would make wonderful history if the mayor of Tucson was in fact jailed for defying the governor of Arizona in 2021.
Well, I don't know her, but I would imagine she wouldn't be adverse to doing that.
I agree. I admire our mayor. I think she would welcome and enjoy the martyrdom and that foolish behavior. Speaking of foolish behavior, Dave, I was wondering if perhaps sometime in the future you and I might sign up for one of Ken Scoville's walking tours and we could heckle him.
I'm sure he would enjoy that.
Ken, would you unmute yourself, please? Ken is Mr. What should we say, Dave? Mr. Downtown Urban.
Can you hear me? Can you
Oh,
hear
yeah.
me? I've got nothing but tech problems today.
Oh,
Well,
dear.
an iPad to speak and using this to see. So it's been an interesting.
Oh, dear. So do you still conduct?
You do a walking tour for you? Maybe, who knows? Maybe you're gonna have to wear a mask, but other than that, I'd be happy to.
Good call. So you do still do walking tours?
Yes, maybe I'm gonna call them pandemic walking tours or something like that. We can talk about smallpox in Tucson in early times, but
Smallpox.
oh yes.
Hmm.
And we actually had vaccines and Dr. Handy and all kinds of interesting stuff.
Were there anti-vaccine riots? I
No,
doubt it.
people were cutting in line to try and get some.
And we had malaria here.
Yes.
No.
Creel Gardens was it when it got stagnant? That was always a good spot.
No, for mosquitoes.
I have to say, I love Tucson's history. It's so, if you dig beneath the surface, it's so turbulent.
Oh, it is. And we have certain trends, which I hopefully have been able to point out, that make this community partially what it is. We have a great batting average of not accomplishing many of the things we set out to do. But that's part of us, right?
Right.
And we argue an awful lot, but that passion is very good, in my opinion.
You know, but
Dave, let me add one thing quick.
Sure.
Can you hear
Yeah.
me? Is that I think one of the greatest achievements for Tucson that will make it be a different place is we have no crosstown freeways. There were so many freeways planned and all of those got stopped that we're going to be a different community. In fact, maybe the largest with no crosstown freeways in the United States. I think that was a real interesting and crowning achievement that will be developed different.
and
Well, there are many people who would argue with that point of view, but that's what I agree with.
well, it's been a joy having historians and Bolsheviks here with us today. I'm teasing, gentlemen. It's been a real pleasure. We have a statement from Allison Hughes. Allison, are you there? Would you care to unmute yourself and share your kind words?
Sure, sure. Yes, a few years back when I had some guests visiting from out of town, there was a ghost tour of downtown Tucson. So I took them so that we could go and view the places downtown with ghosts. And I wondered, are the ghosts still around?
I have no idea. All I can say is, if it helps people learn a little bit about Tucson's history, it's worth it.
And I'll think of an answer that's a pun in about 2 days.
Well, and I was recently offered a job as a ghost writer, and I didn't take it because I like my name on what I.
Sure. Hey, Dave, I hope for the Tucson Festival of Books this coming spring, fingers crossed,
Yes.
that you would be my co-host for a Tucson Trivia Game Show again to close down the book festival. That's always a pleasure. And also, Allison has a good point about the pandemic and health. Tomorrow's event at the Presidio. Bring masks because there are interior spaces where you will want to mask up. And even if you've been vaccinated, it's an act of kindness to others to mask up. Well, I think we're, Sarah Brown, are you there?
I am here.
I think it's about time we can wrap up this program and let Dave return to his historical siesta. And I'm curious, Sarah, what's coming up next week?
Yeah, so we started out our chit chat before this today talking about bugs, which is perfect because next week we have the Bug Man, is what he's known as, Carl Olson, who has retired from the U of A after 38 years as the U of A Department of Entomology Associate Curator of the Insect Research Collection and also Extension Entomologist and Lecturer. He's authored many books about Southwest insects and co-authored many others, as well as training a lot of docent groups locally and elsewhere about bugs. So it'll be interesting to learn a little bit more about the bugs in Southwest and get to know Carl a little bit more.
That sounds terrific. And once again, as far as the Presidio event tomorrow, one of our guests noted in the chat, it might be wise to take the light rail downtown to visit the Presidio, which is a great suggestion. But I agree with Dave. I can't say enough good things about the Presidio. On behalf of, mention my roast. Yeah, Sunday I am going to be roasted at El Casino Ballroom. It's a fundraiser on behalf of Mariachi Cause here in Southern Arizona. And I'm going to be roasted by backstabbers, liars, and fake news peddlers, and even a former mayor. So if you have interest in that, feel free to fire off an email to me or text me, and I'll give you more information about that event. But otherwise, thank you, Dave Devine, so much for being a part of our program today. It was a real pleasure to see you again, my friend.
Thank you.
And
so much for your time.
yeah, and once again, marvelous books. I can't say enough about his very enjoyable books. I guess that does it for our program. I'm Dave Fitzsimmons on behalf of the Arizona Daily Star with my colleague Sarah Brown, thanking each and every one of you for being a part of our reader chat today. Have a glorious weekend, and we will see you tomorrow at the Presidio. All right? Awesome.